In the Long Island area of New York, there's a quiet street named Ocean Avenue. Trees line both sides of the street, and white painted houses stand like silent sentinels in their places on the avenue. Every spring, raindrops softly fall on the roofs of these peaceful, quiet houses. But in the midst of that silence, there is one house that opens the door to terror. Number 112. This house is very different from the others. The small, eye-shaped windows on its roof seem alive when darkness falls, while the street where the house is located carries on its normal flow. Those windows appear to be peering out at people. In fact, sometimes, the unease felt by those passing in front of the house simply refuses to leave them, because according to rumors, the spirits behind those windows are lying in wait to take revenge for the past. The townspeople never call this house by its name. To them, it is simply the place. Because on the night of November the 13th, 1974, a horror unlike anything seen before took place inside that house. A young man named Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed his entire family, his mother, father, 2 sisters, and 2 brothers, as they slept under the same roof. The 6 victims died in silence, and the truly strange thing was that no one heard a single gunshot that night. The police report contained only this sentence: all bodies were found face down, with their arms glued to their bodies. A year later, a young couple named George and Kathy Lutz moved into the house with their 3 children. They wanted a new beginning, a quiet and peaceful life. They were unaware that some houses use silence not as peace, but as a trap. The real estate agent's words still echoed in George's ears. "This is a wonderful opportunity, Mr. Lutz. Lake view, large garden. It's just that its past is a little shadowed." George smiled. "Its past? Well, last year there was a small tragedy here, but the price is very reasonable for the size of the house." Kathy shuddered inwardly. However, the beauty of the house covered up the fear. They wanted to make a fresh start. Along with the house, some of the DeFeo family's belongings had remained. Furniture, curtains, even the toys in the children's room. The Lutz family accepted these as a gift. On her first night in the house, Kathy said a prayer to soothe her soul. "God, grant us peace in our new home." But it was as if that prayer was held captive by the house's stifling walls. For the first few days, everything was normal. The children played in the garden, and George and Kathy watched them from the porch, embracing and smiling. Then, George started to be unable to sleep in the mornings. He woke up every night at 3:15 a.m., the exact time the DeFeo murders had been committed. To him, it was just a habit, but after the 3rd night, these awakenings no longer felt like a coincidence. One morning when George woke up, he noticed that the outside was covered with a thin layer of snow. When he looked at the garden, he saw strange tracks in the snow, resembling small cloven hooves with 2 feet. The tracks started beneath the window, slowly moved toward the wall, and suddenly vanished there. It was as if someone or something had walked up to the wall and suddenly disappeared. George shuddered. There was no logical explanation for the tracks, and the strange silence made him even more uneasy. As the snowflakes quietly fell to the ground, the shadows seemed to take on bizarre shapes around the house. That morning, while cleaning the house, Kathy noticed a heavy odor in one of the strange rooms. In an inquiring tone, she asked George, "George, what exactly is this place?" It was a small room that wasn't even on the house plan. The walls were a reddish-brown terracotta color, and black stains stood out on the floor. It was as if the room's surface had been concealing things for years. George's voice reflected confusion. "I guess it's something like a dog kennel." But a voice inside Kathy ominously said, "Something is wrong here." Her heart began to pound as she entered the room. The smell, the darkness, and the strange atmosphere combined to take her breath away. She felt as though she understood that the room was not a kennel. When bedtime came, their small daughter Missy said she had made an imaginary friend named Jody. Kathy smiled at her daughter's innocence, but that smile did not last long. "And what is Jody like?" she asked. Missy answered with a serious expression. "Like a pig, but she can fly." Kathy's smile froze. Her small daughter's words, combined with the strangeness of the room and the tracks in the snow, sent a shiver from the back of her neck throughout her body. She felt as if she knew that Jody was not an innocent figment of imagination. That night, as Kathy passed Missy's window to close it, she saw two glowing red eyes in the glass. There was nothing outside, but the eyes were there, watching her, not moving, just waiting. Her heart clenched. Her breathing became erratic. The silence filled the inside of the house like a vacuum. The eyes suddenly vanished, but Kathy could not shake the feeling that a presence was still watching her. From that moment on, the house never felt peaceful for the Lutz family. Every time a door creaked, every time a shadow stirred, their instincts whispered to them, there were unseen things here, inside the house. As the night progressed, it became increasingly clear that a dark secret lay behind Missy's innocent games. And Kathy knew now, they were not the only family living in this house. George, on the other hand, was changing. He was constantly cold, continually lighting the fireplace and shivering despite wrapping himself in thick blankets. "This house is cold," he would say every time. But the thermostat read 25 degrees, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Kathy had begun to notice the change in her husband. George's behavior grew harsh, and an invisible tension circulated through the house. Small arguments suddenly turned into fits of rage, and George's eyes became so dark that Kathy inwardly thought, "This man is not my husband." One Sunday, they called a priest, Father Mancuso, to bless the family and dispel the dark influences on the house. The moment Father Mancuso entered the house, he was filled with an unnatural anger that made him shudder. The silence was almost suffocating, the air thick and heavy. When he went upstairs, he reached the old room of the DeVio children. The moment he stepped into the room, a whisper struck his ear, "Get out!" The voice was so close that the priest instinctively turned around, but there was no one behind him. He began to pray hastily. The words came out of his lips trembling. Just then, the metal of the cross in his hand burned with a terrifying heat, and blisters appeared on the priest's hands. From that day on, the priest was bedridden with high fever and unbearable pain. His eyes were weary and full of fear from what they had witnessed. Events quickly began to spiral out of control. The house had already become a living nightmare. Slimy green liquid flowed from the walls, and a sticky, muddy substance pooled on the floor. Their dog barked continuously at the same spot, its barks piercing the night. George told his wife that he heard deep, rhythmic drumming sounds coming from the basement. The sound was so real that every beat he heard with his ears shook his chest. Kathy, meanwhile, felt someone touching her in bed at night. At first, she thought it was a dream, but the touches were vivid, warm, and non-human. One night she woke up, looked in the mirror, and didn't recognize her own face. Her skin was wrinkled, and her hair was completely white. In a moment of terror, she recoiled, and when she closed and reopened her eyes, everything was normal. But she was now afraid to look in the mirror. George also didn't recognize himself when he looked in the mirror. The dog's constant barking, doors opening and closing by themselves, lights exploding. The house was slowly consuming them with every action. Shadows took on different shapes in every room, reminding them of its presence, sometimes with watching eyes, sometimes with silent clicks. The Lutz family's instincts whispered that the house's boundaries had become a trap rather than a living space. At night, even the silence of the house was a threat. The howling of the wind, the creaking of the walls, and the constant echo of footsteps in the background drove their minds toward madness. Kathy and George now looked at each other with fear-filled suspicion, and even Missy's joy was fading under the shadows. Nothing was normal in this house anymore. The dark presence, full of the past's anger and unseen forces, had begun to consume the Lutz family's lives piece by piece. Finally, Kathy spoke, trying to keep her voice firm. "We have to leave here." George did not answer. He only stared blankly at the wall. A whisper echoing inside the house answered instead of him. "You will not leave." The voice came so coldly and sharply that the young couple's hair stood on end. That night, there was a storm outside. The wind hit every wall of the house, violently shaking the windows, and as if howling along with the dark presence inside the house. It amplified their fear. The children began to cry with every strong gust of wind and every movement of a shadow. The sounds from the basement were no longer just rhythmic like drumming, but also began to resemble voices. Muffled sobs, screams, and chilling prayers echoed from the basement. George grabbed his gun. "That's enough." His voice came out determined. He started to go down. His steps were not silent. Every stair turned into an echo that howled with the darkness of the house. And at that moment, the walls of the house groaned painfully. The house was alive. Steam rose from the walls, doors slammed shut by themselves, and curtains flickered with a blood-red light. These sounds, combined with the howling of the wind, turned the inside of the house into a terrifying symphony. Kathy immediately embraced the children and ran outside. Her legs were trembling, and she kept looking back as she ran. George turned at the creaking sound coming from the stairs he had just descended. Hidden in the darkness at the top of the stairs, the ghosts of the DeFeo family stood directly in front of him. All were silent, their faces bowed, looking into a blank darkness as if they had no eyes. At that moment, all the darkness and anger of the house poured out onto George. Breathing was impossible. The storm outside merged with the fear inside, turning into a nightmare. Kathy, holding her children tightly, wanted to get out, but the house came up before them like a trap with every step. Kathy looked at George, tears in her eyes and her breath ragged. "We must run. Now," she whispered, but George's gaze was still fixed. The ghosts at the top of the stairs continued to watch the family. Like vultures, they moved to take the Lutz family's souls captive. They wanted to tear apart their young bodies, satisfy their fears, and add them to their own corrupted souls. George's heart froze, his chest heavy. At that moment, he felt that the darkness inside the house was about to swallow them. That night, the Lutz family somehow escaped from the house. When they got into the car, they heard screams rising from the house behind them. As the car sped up, The screams and the red light bursting from the window slowly faded behind them. They never returned to the house. 112 Ocean Avenue became just a bad dream they had left behind, or so they thought. After that night, George drove without stopping the car. The rain hit the headlights, sparkling like thousands of tiny broken glass pieces. The children were silent in the back. Fear and exhaustion were visible on their faces. Kathy's hands could not stop trembling for a long time. She still could not shake the feeling of being inside the house. It was as if that house, once entered, had permeated their bodies, minds, and souls. The next day, when the police searched the house, they found no trace inside. There was no green liquid, no red lights, and nothing to indicate the house's dark secrets. There was only one word scratched with a fingernail on the wall of the small red room in the basement. Stay. The Lutz family stayed in a motel for a short time. Even though George locked everything, he could not shake the strange unease inside him. His eyes constantly scanned the corners of the room, looking for movement in the shadows. "Listen to me, Kathy," he said in a harsh but shaky voice. "There is something in that house. Real. A living thing." Kathy cried silently, the weight of helplessness crashing down on her shoulders. "I can still hear its voice, George," she whispered. "It whispers to me. Non-stop, day and night." Toward morning, Kathy started screaming in her sleep. In her dream, she entered the house's door, searched for her children in the basement, and heard voices weeping and supplicating behind the walls. With every step, an ice-cold hand grabbed her, and a corrupted presence revolved around her like a shadow. When she woke up, her pillow was soaked with blood, but there were no wounds on her body. That house had played with their minds until now, but physical harm was new. It was as if the ghosts were angry because they had been abandoned. When George woke up, he held Kathy's trembling hands. "Everything is over," he said to himself, but the words felt like a lie, because no matter how far they ran, the darkness and the screams of the house had not left them alone. They understood that 112 Ocean Avenue was a living, breathing nightmare seeking revenge, and the shadow of revenge had been etched into the Lutz family's lives. A week later, the news of the Amityville horror hit the headlines of the New York Times. "Young family flees cursed house." The headline created a wave of excitement and fear throughout the area. Journalists wanting to do interviews soon knocked on the Lutz family's door. There were those who believed the house was cursed, and also those who thought the incident was a hoax, that the family had made everything up to make money. But George's statement was clear and shocking. There is an anger-filled evil in that house. It was slowly turning us into itself. As the pressure from the press increased, the Lutz family began to collapse psychologically. George no longer woke up at random times at night, not just at 3:15 a.m., as before. He opened his eyes at senseless times around midnight, and in the early morning watched the shadows on the walls and felt that a presence in the room was watching him. Kathy was afraid to stand in front of the mirror. Every reflection showed her that old, wrinkled, and terrifying face again. The children continued to have nightmares, and little Missy still whispered in an eerie way, "Jody is calling me." One night, George dreamed. He was standing in front of the basement door of that house. The door slowly opened by itself, and a freezing coldness emanated from inside onto his face. The DeFeo family slowly emerged from the depths of the room, all face down, silent and threatening. George couldn't breathe. Just then, One of them lifted their head. A pig-faced entity with red eyes appeared. Its voice was like a threat that penetrated the soul. "We are not finished with you." George woke up with a scream. He was drenched in sweat, his chest pounding fast, his hands shaking, but his nightmare was not yet over. The air in the room he was sleeping in had changed. A sharp and disturbing smell of sulfur came from somewhere. With every breath, it was as if the house was still following him, integrating the fear with his body. George's eyes scanned the corners of the room. There was no movement, but the silence was also terrifying. The darkness of that house seemed to have crossed its boundaries and extended into George's room. Kathy woke up with a start from her sleep. George's breathing and the changes in the room had deeply shaken her. The small children were still asleep, but the pressure felt in the room seemed to be mixing with their dreams. George and Kathy, tired and exhausted, hugged each other. A silent house on an ordinary street would now be the source of their greatest nightmares until death. When events spun out of control, Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned paranormal investigators in New England, became involved. The Warren couple had encountered and gained experience with many terrifying incidents similar to exorcist cases before. Lorraine was a medium. She could see the unseen and communicate with entities. Ed was a researcher trained in Catholic demonology, working with rituals and sacred objects. Together, they prepared to uncover the secrets of the Amityville House. In early 1976, the Warrens came to Amityville with a small team. The house had been empty for a year. As soon as they entered, the air was still heavy, damp, dark, and suffocating. Ed paused silently for a moment at the threshold of the door, taking a deep breath. Lorraine's face was pale. Her eyes were dark, and her lips were trembling. "This place," she whispered, "is a place abandoned by God." The team settled into the house. Cameras, temperature sensors, and audio recorders were set up. The equipment they placed in the corners of the rooms would document the unseen, cursed energy of the house. However, no one had gone upstairs yet. Lorraine closed her eyes and began to pray. Just then, a cold wave spread inside. All the lights suddenly flickered. One of the cameras had taken a picture by itself, although no one had touched it. Then Lorraine collapsed onto the floor. Tears streamed from her eyes. Her lips were trembling. "I see them. 6 people, all on the floor, and someone is still here." Ed immediately leaned toward her. "Who?" he asked. Lorraine pointed her trembling finger toward the basement door. "There, behind the wall. That thing doesn't want the family. It wants the house." The Warren team went down to the basement. A sharp smell of mold, dampness, and decaying flesh stung their noses. In the light of the flashlight, a small reddish-brown room appeared. There were fingernail marks above its door. A black, sticky substance dripped from a corner of the wall onto the floor. It was as if the wall was bleeding. Ed held the flashlight and looked inside. "This room could be an area where satanic rituals were performed," he said. Lorraine nodded silently, but her eyes were wide with terror. "No. This is a gateway," she whispered. Just then, the sound of metal scraping came from inside the room. It was as if someone was being dragged on the floor with chains. One of the cameras tipped over and hit the floor. When Ed went to check the camera, he realized they had captured a strange, crackling sound. "Get out of here. This place is not yours." Lorraine screamed when she heard the sound. When they left the small room, the red paint on the wall had begun to move. Thermal sensors showed sudden drops and rises in the house's temperature. The basement reached -7 degrees Celsius, 19.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the upstairs reached 32 degrees Celsius, 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit. One of the photos the team took was striking. A white silhouette had appeared on the stairs, and even today, the figure of a small child with glowing eyes standing in the doorway upstairs, one of the world's most famous photos, is still referred to as real paranormal evidence. Lorraine was very affected by what she felt in the basement, yet she entered the house again that night. A moment of silence prevailed. Then the house walls began to tremble, and howls rose from the small red room. Lorraine knelt down, tears streaming from her eyes, and whispered, "In this house, evil itself lives. That thing has chosen this house as a temple." At that moment, Lorraine's eyes opened wide. Thousands of small whispers rose from the walls and echoed at the same time. "Don't leave. Stay. Stay." Ed grabbed her arm and pulled her outside. When they closed the door, a sound like an explosion came from inside. The entire team retreated. The incident had turned out to be bigger than they expected. The Warren couple wrote in their report, "This house is the center of a demonic energy. This is not an ordinary haunted house. The curse is integrated with the entire house like a living entity. The Lutz family is lucky to have survived from there. The Lutz family never read that report written about them." "I don't want to know what they are," George said. But at night, he could swear he heard a whisper from afar whenever the wind blew. The whisper always said, "Come back, come back." After fleeing Amityville, the Lutz family moved to another state. Everything they left behind was still there: furniture, photos, even their children's toys. But with the decision never to return to that house, they tried to continue their lives, leaving their belongings behind. Otherwise, their lives had not changed, because that thing in the house was after them. In the summer of 1976, newspapers were still talking about Amityville. Headlines like, "Is the Amityville curse real?" were being published, and the next headline asked the question, "Did the Lutz family run away in fear or for money?" The press had sensationalized the incident. Psychics, priests, and so-called exorcists debated the incident on television programs. To some, everything was just a lie, an exaggeration. Some neighborhood residents even said these events were nonsense. But to others, the Lutz family had touched hell and faced the house's terror. Every time they saw a new news report, George and Kathy relived that night. Kathy's hands were still ice cold at night, and George shivered when he looked in the mirror in the mornings, because sometimes his own reflection smiled as if it had its own consciousness. Those moments brought back the terrible memories of the past, and the terror they had lived through never completely left their world. One day, while Kathy was washing dishes in the kitchen, the phone rang. When she answered, there was only breathing on the other line. "Who is this?" Kathy asked, but there was no answer. Only a whisper resembling a howl echoed, "Return." She slammed the phone down, but it rang again the next day, then another day, and another day. George had the line checked. The calling number did not appear on any record. That night, George woke up with a start again from his sleep. The phone was ringing by itself, and when he picked up the receiver, he heard his own voice. "You must go back home," the voice on the phone said. Journalists did not leave the Lutz family alone for a long time. Even a television channel made an offer to the family. "Tell us what you experienced and we will give you money in return," they had said. George replied angrily, "What we experienced is priceless. But at that time, some people who called themselves witnesses emerged and began to twist the story. One man said, "I was with the Lutzes in that house, nothing happened." Another person gave an interview saying, "This is a completely fabricated story." Lies like a web woven around the truth were tightening around them. Kathy cried silently. "They don't understand," she said, trembling. "Our fear is not about money. That house is still calling us. I hear its voice. It's waiting for us." As time passed, strange changes began in George. In the first months after fleeing the house, everything seemed more normal except for the nightmares. They had returned to their daily lives, taking care of the children, going to work, shopping. But soon, oddities began to appear in George's behavior. He was constantly looking at maps, finding old photos of Ocean Avenue and collecting newspapers. Examining the house plans had become an obsession for him. "The house plan is drawn incorrectly," he said one evening. "There is another room under the basement. We never saw it." Kathy was scared. George's eyes, normally loving, now looked empty and dull. "George, please stop talking about this," she said in a shaky voice. But George's attention was completely focused on that room. "That room is calling me, it seems," he whispered. The night of the same day, George found himself back at the door of Amityville in his dream. The door slowly opened and a warm and suffocating breath hit his face from inside. It was as if the house was breathing and inviting him inside, never to return. He heard the whisper of a cold but familiar tone. "We missed you." When George woke up out of breath, there were mud marks on his hands. It was as if he had touched the soil and walked in the house's basement. He could no longer distinguish whether what he saw was real or a dream. A year after the Lutz family's escape, another couple bought 112 Ocean Avenue, Jim and Barbara Cromartie. They said that all curse claims were ridiculous, mocking the news published in the newspapers. "Yes, a murder was committed in that house, but we are quite peaceful," Barbara said. Newspapers began to publish headlines like "The curse is over" in those days. But in that house, some things were still shifting. The Cromartie couple were either unaware of this or preferred to remain silent, even if they were. Some neighbors said they saw beams of light coming out of the house at night. Shadows stirred on the walls, and the rooms seemed to fill and empty with the breath of a presence. Every time the police went to the house, they found everything silent and normal. But every officer who entered had noticed the heavy, suffocating atmosphere they felt. Some said they had difficulty breathing, and others stated that the energy of the rooms was abnormal. The house was still alive. In every wall, every dark corner, there was a movement, a shadow, a sound. Even if the Cromartie couple did not see or feel it, the house's energy was still there, writing its own rules and quietly testing its new residents. That red house on Ocean Avenue could not forget the massacre it had experienced in the past. The oddities concerning the family members murdered in the house were still unresolved. The creaking of the doors, the howls rising from the rooms, and the dark shadows were like harbingers of a new terror that could reappear at any moment. One night, while Kathy was praying to get rid of her nightmares and heal her husband, she suddenly collapsed onto the floor. She felt an indescribable tightness in her heart. She had difficulty breathing. She closed her eyes, but her mind had lost control. She felt as if she had been dragged back to that house. She was standing in the red room in the basement of 112 Ocean Avenue. The walls were alive, The red paint flowed like blood, as if the room itself was breathing. The air was heavy, damp, and suffocating. Every breath was filled with a new wave of fear. A mirror appeared in the middle of the room. Kathy, trembling, approached the mirror and could not believe her eyes. She did not see her own reflection, but Jodi's eyes. The little girl's gaze was cold and empty, but her whisper penetrated her mind. George will be back soon. And this time, he won't be able to escape. Kathy came to with a scream. When she blinked, the room was quieter than when she had left it. George was sitting in the corner of the room, tightly holding an old photograph of the house. Kathy ran toward him. "Kathy," George said in a tone that could not be refused, "I have to go there." "No," Kathy said, trembling. "If I don't go, it will come here," George whispered. In the following weeks, George fell prey to paranoia. He was sleepless, angry, and restless. He knew he was not inside that house, but every time he looked in the mirror, the windows of 112 Ocean Avenue appeared before him, and he felt those red eyes were still watching him. When he woke up at night, he thought the shadows in the room were moving. Even the silence had begun to become unbearable for him. One night, Kathy woke up from her sleep and did not find George in bed. The window was open, and a thin rain continued outside. When Kathy looked out in fear, she saw George's bare footprints. The tracks extended up to the garden entrance and suddenly stopped there. Her entire body was shaken with fear as her heart pounded fast. Kathy immediately informed the police. The officers came and examined the house and the garden, but could not find George's tracks. The next morning, George simply appeared at the door. His clothes were muddy, his eyes were bloodshot. "I just walked a bit," George said. There was a strangeness in his voice. "With whom? Where?" Kathy asked, her eyes tearful and full of terror. "To the house," George said, his gaze fixed on the emptiness behind Kathy. Kathy soon noticed the reason for the strangeness in her husband. There was a burn-like mark on the back of George's neck, caused by cold. It was as if an invisible, icy hand had touched him and burned his skin. Kathy was already aware that the house was following them, despite the years that had passed. But now, the house had managed to pull George's mind and body into its own darkness. For the rest of their lives, George and Kathy tried not to talk about Amityville. Speaking was like summoning the dark shadows of the past again. They preferred to keep their fears inside, silently. As years passed, the city changed. People moved. But the shadow of 112 Ocean Avenue still followed them. In the last years of George's life, he was said to frequently repeat the same sentence to his friends. The thing inside that house was not a ghost attached to Amityville. They came with us wherever we went. That sentence was an admission of both fear and helplessness. Because George knew that the entity living in the Amityville house did not recognize physical distance, it watched them at all times and influenced them. In short, it had haunted the Lutz family until their death. Years later, as the late 1980s approached, George Lutz had aged and spent most of his life in silence, but that house still entered his dreams. The same nightmare every night, footsteps echoing as he descended the stairs, warm breaths seeping from the walls, and that whisper, "You will not leave." A documentary team reached George years later. They wanted to interview him. At first, he refused. "I don't want to mess with the past that much," he said. But after days of silence, he changed his mind. He only uttered this sentence: "Sometimes a person tries to bury their past, but whispers still come from under the ground. When the filming day arrived, the camera and microphones were ready. George began to speak. His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling. As he recounted what the Lutz family had experienced, it was as if he was reliving that moment. Just then, one of the microphones in the room began to crackle by itself. Then, a strange howl spread throughout the recording room, and a muffled male voice was heard behind it. "He is lying." The technical team could not explain that sound. There was no static, echo, or background sound recorded on the devices. It was only heard at that moment, only while George was speaking. When he watched the recording, George remained silent for a long time. Tears streamed from his eyes, and he only whispered, "It's still there, and it's still watching me." Today, as we reach the present day, 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville is now a legend. People travel hundreds of miles to satisfy their curiosity, test their own courage, or just to take pictures. Some pray, pressing their hands to their chests, trying to suppress their fears. But they all feel the same thing: a heavy, unseen pressure and a suffocating silence. The house secretly etches its own presence into the soul of every visitor. Ed and Lorraine Warren had filed the case with a high danger level in their records. Even a couple as experienced as they were did not underestimate the house's power. Lorraine met with the Lutz family a few more times. After every meeting, she was sick for several days. Headaches, fever, night terrors held her captive, as if the house's energy had also permeated her mind and body. One night, tired and exhausted, she wrote this in her diary: "There is no one demon in the house. There is a collective of entities here. It is a door, and doors are not one way." Ed was more cautious. He understood what Lorraine felt, but acted more carefully. "The connection with that house needs to be severed," he said quietly. "But some bonds are not cut, because they have settled inside the person." That dark energy that had permeated the soul, mind, and fears of George and Kathy continued to live within them as well. That house remained a secret in the minds of many people throughout history. Photos, newspapers, and stories spread. But the truth was as deep and terrifying as what only the Lutz family and the Warren couple had experienced. 112 Ocean Avenue still waits silently in the heart of Amityville, reminding of its existence with every shadow and every howl. The Amityville case attracted the attention of not only paranormal investigators, but also scientists over the years. The rumors circulating among the public, the headlines in the newspapers, and the stories told by the Lutz family had resonated so much that the subject had ceased to be merely a supernatural matter and turned into a scientific curiosity. Psychologists, sociologists, and even physicists began to look for rational reasons behind the events. Psychologists tried to explain the incident with the possibility of mass hysteria. According to them, the Lutz family might have been seized by a collective hallucination under the influence of both the tragedy in the house's past and the atmosphere of fear created by society. They might have had post-traumatic hallucinations, it was said. After all, fear was contagious. Once it started, the mind could create its own ghosts. But the issue was not that simple, because the evidence made a simple psychological explanation impossible. Audio recordings, thermal images, photographs. Some were not normal. The thermal data, in particular, astonished scientists. A physics professor wrote this note in his research report: "The temperature difference measured inside the house contradicts the laws of nature." Energy is emanating from a source, but the source cannot be identified. In 1976, Ed and Lorraine Warren's team had conducted 24-hour monitoring with the cameras they placed in the house. One of the cameras was a special model that took pictures without a person and automatically flashed when movement was detected. Nothing was recorded for days. One day at 3:15 a.m., the flash went off by itself. Neither a human voice was heard nor any movement was detected. But when the films were developed in the laboratory later, the team froze in terror. In one of the photos, a small boy was standing in the doorway of the upstairs hallway. His eyes were shining pure white, the face of the child that appeared in this frame, one of the world's most famous paranormal photographs, was identical to John Matthew DeFeo, the youngest son of the DeFeo family. However, that child had been murdered in his sleep by his older brother 2 years earlier. The photograph was examined in FBI laboratories. Experts analyzed the image multiple times. No sign of manipulation, cutting, or montage was found. Neither light reflection, shadow play, nor double exposure. None of them were sufficient to explain this image. Time passed. Years were not enough to erase Amityville's dark fame. The house was sold again in 1987. The new owners renovated the house from top to bottom. The famous eye-shaped windows on the roof, those ominous openings that had been the house's symbol since the DeFeo murders, were changed. The facade was painted, the garden was landscaped, and even the address number was changed for privacy reasons. 112 Ocean Avenue no longer existed on paper, but to the neighbors, that house was still the same house. Every late afternoon when the sun set, an ominous howl echoed in the walls of that house as the wind passed down the street. No one spoke loudly, and children did not even want to ride their bikes in front of that street. Because on some nights, exactly at 3:15 in the morning, short beams of light would appear in the windows and then suddenly extinguish. Even when it was empty, the house was breathing like a living entity. One night, a middle-aged woman living in the neighborhood went out onto the street to drop a letter in the mailbox. The air was cool and the area was silent. Just as she reached out to the mailbox, she noticed something in the first-floor window of the house, a thin, long-haired female silhouette. The woman seemed to have parted the curtain and was watching outside. But no one lived in that house. The woman screamed and called the police. Patrols arrived within minutes. The door was opened without force. Inside was completely silent. Dust, cobwebs, the smell of old furniture. Everything indicated that no one had touched it for years. However, on the kitchen table, 2 words were written with shaky finger marks on a thin layer of dust. "We are here." The police reports never determined who this writing belonged to. The dust dispersed by itself minutes later. Only a vague trace remained in the photographs, as if even the words wanted to be erased. From that day on, neighbors began to walk around the perimeter of the house at night. No one passed on that sidewalk. No matter how nice the weather was, the street in front of 112 Ocean Avenue always remained in shadow. Lorraine Warren spoke almost nothing about Amityville in the last years of her life. When the press asked questions, she would smile and change the subject. But a few pages in her diary, found after her death, were dedicated to that house. These sentences were written there. "The curse of Amityville feeds on people's fear. Whoever remembers that house, the door opens a little wider years after the events. George Lutz passed away on a cold, winter morning in 2006, the news echoed in the silence of Amityville. Newspapers announced the death of the man once known as the victim of the cursed house, with a small headline, "Man who fled Amityville dies." The air was hazy at the funeral. Kathy stood, her head bowed, in a black dress. She could neither hear the priest's words nor the whispers among the crowd. All she did was repeat the same sentence in her mind as she looked at the tombstone. "It's over." "It's over now," a friend approached her, put a hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "He's at peace now." Kathy then whispered, almost inaudibly, without lifting her head, "I'm not sure." That night, when Kathy fell asleep, she found herself on Ocean Avenue again. The air was cold. The wind shivered the pine trees as it passed down that familiar road. The house number 112 appeared in the darkness in the distance. Its windows were still shining with those familiar eyes. It had new residents now. Kathy stopped her steps. Her heart was beating loudly. The house was silent, but in the silence there was a breath. And then she heard that voice, "Welcome." Kathy felt herself being pulled into a deep darkness. She never woke up from her sleep again. When morning came, the house was silent. Daylight seeping through the curtains fell on the edge of the bed. Kathy's face looked peaceful, but on the small notepad next to her bed, there was a single sentence written in her own handwriting. "That house found me." Doctors said it was a heart attack, and the file was closed. But that night, the wind passing over Ocean Avenue had shaken the windows again. One neighbor said, "Just like in the old days, as if someone is walking inside."